Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. My name is Eric White. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the Estes Valley Library in Estes Park, Colorado. We're super excited to have Ximena Vengoechea here to talk about her book and our Conflict Resolution Month title, Listen Like You Mean It. I will introduce Ximena here in a moment, but first I wanted to cover a couple quick details about this afternoon's talk. Once we get rolling, I'll be in conversation with Ximena for roughly the first half to 2/3 of our talk, and then I'll open it up to questions. The chat feature is open to everyone, so if you have a question, just put it in the chat. You can submit questions at any time during the talk, and we will consolidate them and put them to Ximena during the Q&A. If during the webinar you're having a technical issue, or if you have a question about Zoom, feel free to put your question in the chat, and Misty, our awesome volunteer, will work with you to see if we can get that resolved. All right. So first, I would like to go ahead and acknowledge the folks who brought us today's talk. First, as you may know, this talk is the culminating event of Phoenix Strategy's 18th Annual Conflict Resolution Conference. Just a little bit about Phoenix. They provide mediation and facilitation services and conflict management training and coaching in Denver and Colorado Springs. Every year they hold a conference for folks invested in conflict resolution, and the theme of this year's conference is wellness. So I wanted to acknowledge all the conference folks who are joining us here. Second, I want to acknowledge Conflict Resolution Month in Colorado. A little bit about them. They are a dynamic volunteer group of conflict resolution advocates, restorative justice practitioners, mediators, nonprofit representatives, educators, college students, elected officials, and community members. Every year, they select a book that enhances problem-solving skills and/or inspires dialogue. They distribute more than 300 copies of the book across Colorado to the governor and lieutenant governor, all of the legislators, and the Supreme District and Appellate Court judges, alternative dispute resolution professionals, and various public libraries. Listen Like You Mean It was this year's title, and they, along with Phoenix Strategies, were instrumental in bringing you today's talk. Finally, my library partners with the Estes Valley Restorative Justice Partnership to bring Conflict Resolution Month to the Estes Valley. All right, so now let's introduce our guest. Ximena Vengoechea is a user researcher, writer, and illustrator whose work on personal and professional development has been published in Inc., The Washington Post, Newsweek, Forbes, and the Huffington Post. Ximena is a contributor at Fast Company and The Muse, and writes Letters from Ximena, a newsletter about staying curious, getting creative, and living well. She is also the creator of the popular project, The Life Audit. Ximena is a keynote speaker on topics such as empathetic and inclusive listening, navigating difficult conversations, and preventing burnout. She previously worked at Pinterest, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and currently advises select startups and executives on user research, executive communication, and resting well. In 2021, she published Listen Like You Mean It, and her latest book is Rest Easy, Discover Calm and Abundance Through the Radical Power of Rest. Welcome, Ximena.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here.
All right, so let's start. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you and what led you to write a book about being a better listener?
Yeah, so the book sort of came from a few different places. One, I think my experience as a user researcher. For those who aren't familiar, it's a role in the tech industry where essentially your job is to understand your users or prospective users, the people who will use your product or your platform, and try to understand them so that you can make things work better for them, meet their needs, and essentially design something that actually, matters to people, as opposed to having a shiny idea that, maybe as a founder or a product person you're excited about, but nobody really needs. And so it's one of the more people-centered roles in the tech industry. And it relies a lot on listening, as at least on the qualitative side. And it involves a lot of interviewing or facilitating group workshops to pull some of this data out of people, these perceptions, their needs, their motivations. And while I was doing that training and gaining that experience, I think a lot of what I was learning about and applying in a lab setting, it became clear that these were also very applicable in the real world. And at first I kind of saw it in a work setting where I could kind of tell in a meeting, who was being heard and who wasn't, and maybe there were ways to facilitate a group conversation better. And then it kind of trickled out from there into my personal life as well. And at the same time, we were the US was in a period of great change and perhaps not the most productive conversations. I think I wrote the proposal in 2018, just to give you a sense of where we were then. And it felt like there was a lot of really strong feelings and not a ton of actual communication, like true communication. And so to me, I sort of started to see this disconnect and think maybe there's a way, in my small way, to try and bridge some of that by offering what I've learned about listening to others.
Awesome. So let's get into that. Let's get into the listening side a little bit more. How would you characterize the way we listen most of the time, and what are we missing?
So I think that most of the time when we are not really paying attention or intentionally working on our listening, I call this surface listening. So when we're in surface listening mode, we hear enough in the conversation to sort of nod and smile. We're not totally rude. We're there in the conversation, but we're not necessarily getting much beyond the surface, the literal that's being spoken. And that's okay. But we end up missing a lot of what's beneath the surface. So we miss, the subtext, what's not being said, how is it being said, what's being meant by what's being said, what's the emotion behind what's being said. So there's a lot more that when you're just kind of skimming at the surface, which we do for a variety of reasons, because we're busy, because we're distracted, because we're not interested in a topic, all of those things can get in the way of us actually really hearing what the other person is saying.
Okay, so if our goal then is to connect and to really hear someone, what do we need to do differently?
Yeah, so I talk about this as, one of the first steps, and I call this kind of listening empathetic listening, when you're kind of going beneath the surface and getting a little bit deeper, all the way down to the emotional experience of that person, or what emotion they're bringing to the conversation. I talk about establishing a listening mindset as kind of, first step. And that involves bringing curiosity, humility, and empathy into a conversation. Those sound pretty straightforward, but I think most of us actually probably don't intentionally really foster those in conversation. And so for something like curiosity, it maybe is easy for us to lean into a conversation if it's a topic we're not interested in. That we are interested in, rather, but it's harder if it's something, that we're not naturally drawn to. So we have to work a little bit harder. I think curiosity also can get sidetracked if we have really strong opinions about something. If we have if we're really passionate about something, or if we really feel that we're right about something and the other person is wrong, that can also shut down curiosity. So we really want to think about ways to foster curiosity. So it's asking questions and allowing for an opportunity to learn something from the other person. And that really directly connects also to humility. So it's coming in with an open mind, an open enough mind where you're willing to ask a question, even if you have these really strong preconceived notions about, what is right, what is wrong, or whatever it may be, or even if you're an expert on a topic. I think humility is really allowing for the idea that the other person has something to teach you, that they can be your teacher in this conversation in some way, even if you're a subject matter expert, right? Even if you technically, literally have more knowledge in a certain area, what can you learn from them based on their perspective? And then empathy, when we bring that humility in, it's going to allow us to ask better, deeper questions that are going to hopefully take us down to that place where we can understand someone's emotional experience. Sometimes I think we feel like we can't connect with someone if we haven't had the exact experience. Like, well, I don't know what it's like to, go through a divorce. So I don't really know what to say to somebody who's going through that. But it's not necessarily about the exact situation so much as the underlying emotion. So, okay, maybe you've never experienced that, but you have experienced grief in some way. You have experienced a sense that your life is maybe not going where you thought it would. You have felt unmoored. And so it's really about getting down there to understand what is going on for this other person, and how can that help me understand them better to ultimately connect with them better.
And just to drill a little bit on the emotions part, like the book so often comes back to getting at our partner's emotions, conversation partner's emotions or feelings. Why is that so important?
I think that we we sometimes pretend emotions aren't there in every room, in every conversation, but they're always there to some degree. Just like our personal experience, our personal history, all of that is there too. But I think the level of emotions is really where we start to connect with people. Kind of like it's like a human to human thing, where it's like I can strip away a difference of opinion, or I can strip away a political, differences, whatever it may be, and just get down to I know what it feels like to be upset, to be disappointed. And I think that's just a really fundamental building block for connection that we often don't allow ourselves to explore.
And so sort of thinking about exploring those things in conversation, one concept I liked from the book was the listening loop. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the listening loop is really about creating some trust in your conversation. So what can sometimes happen is, if I'm not demonstrating, let's say, curiosity or humility, if I'm kind of on my own agenda, that doesn't really give you much to work with, right? It's not really feeding into the conversation in a meaningful way. Whereas if I take this more open approach and really show you that I'm listening and that I'm here to learn from you, in most cases, that turns out to be very encouraging for the other person. And they're able to share something with you. And that sharing, it kind of keeps going, where now you've heard something, you've learned something, you have more information to empathize and to continue that circle of trust. And then, hopefully it also works the other way, where, it's not a one-sided conversation. But it sort of feeds on itself in a really good way. You get some momentum out of it.
Okay, yeah, so it's sort of a mutually reinforcing cycle,
Exactly.
kind of connection and trust and vulnerability. So in conversation, I wanted to ask, so the book talks a lot about staying present and being a good observer. So, and one thing I connected with, you talk about the importance of being present, observing while you listen. As someone who sometimes facilitates conversation, I often find myself trying to anticipate what the speaker might say. Especially worst case scenarios, that I can be ready with a pivot or a follow-up question when the time comes. Why is this not the best use of my mental resources? And how does trust come into play in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's something that we all do in various settings. So you're kind of talking about it in a facilitation setting. And I think, we probably all do this like with our spouses, with our parents, with our children, right? Where it's sort of like you start to anticipate what the other person will say. And I guess there's a couple of challenges here, which is you know, sometimes when we're so busy planning for either what the other person might say or what we might say, your brain, like, it can't do both things at the same time. It can't listen and anticipate. So what happens then is that you are just anticipating or just planning what you will say. And there's different reasons for this. Maybe you want to make sure the conversation doesn't go off the rails, and that's fine. Maybe you don't want to forget something, or it's the conversation has sparked an idea that you're really excited about, and so you're kind of holding that and ready to share it. All of those impulses are normal and make sense. But the challenge is that, by focusing on that, which is where our natural bias is, which is, our opinion, we lose out on hearing what the other person is going to say. And usually they can also tell, like, oh, I'm being managed in this conversation in some way. And so really it's about, again, putting trust in the conversation, putting trust in the other person, and also trust in yourself. So a lot of people, when they do start to do this kind of mental planning, it's because they're afraid they're going to forget something, or there's some kind of fear. It's like, I'm afraid I'm going to forget to ask this next question, or I'm afraid to forget this last detail. And some of that trust is just trust in yourself that if it's really important, you're going to remember it. Usually that's what happens. It's like the little details, they may come and go, but the really important stuff tends to stick with us. And just like giving it a shot and seeing what happens, and giving yourself a chance to be, I think pleasantly surprised by what happens when you do put trust into the conversation.
It's funny, when I came to that part as I was reading the book, I'm kind of a compulsive note taker who my notes tend to start out summarizing, and then by the end of, like, before I know it, I'm like writing down everything. And
You've
I
written a
actually
second book.
yeah, exactly. And so I applied that advice to the reading of your book as I was going through and taking notes.
Nice.
So suppose so getting a little bit more into kind of navigating conversation. So suppose I'm talking with a close friend, and he might be telling me about something that's frustrating him at work. My instinct is to dig into the issues he's having and see whether I can sort of dig into those details, find a solution for him. Why might or might not that be helpful?
Yeah, so it sounds like you're a problem solver in conversation. And I outline this as one of several default listening modes. So your default listening mode is essentially, the way you tend to show up in conversation, the particular filter that you bring to the conversation, which has to do with your personality, how you're raised, cultural aspects as well, or even the setting. Maybe you toggle that a little bit depending on who you're talking to. But most of us have one that is a little bit more naturally us. The thing with these modes, and I can mention a few by way of example, but the thing to know about these modes is we all have them. No mode is better or worse than the other. The trick is really to figure out when to apply which one in conversation. Because they are our default, it is very comfortable for us to default to that. To, if you hear your friend has some kind of challenge, to go, okay, let me see how I can help. Or if you hear, a colleague gripe about their workload, think about, like, okay, what needs to change, right? And sometimes those things are welcome, and sometimes it's not. Like, maybe your friend is venting to you because they just need to get it out. They just need the cathartic moment of, like, just expressing, like, man, this is hard. And maybe they might be insulted by your offering to help, right? They might be like, wait a minute, I've got this. Like, I'm just trying to lay it all out there, but I'm not actually expecting any advice. And in fact, like, why are you giving me advice? Don't you think I can handle this on my own? Like, what's that about? So we can sometimes use the wrong mode for the situation or for the person. And so it's really about trying to understand, what does this person actually need from this conversation? And so I'll just share a few examples, and maybe folks in the audience can kind of think about, which of these modes feels most like them. I won't go through all of them, but just so that folks have an idea, there is this problem solving mode, which Eric is mentioning and which I also deeply relate to. I think that is for sure my mode. There's also the mediator. So this is the person who really wants everybody to get along, is kind of thinking about, how everybody's contributing to a situation. And so a mediator in this scenario might be thinking about, like, okay, well, how did this problem happen? Who's involved? Like, well, what might they have had on their plate? Which can be really useful, which can provide perspective. And also, if that's not what the person is looking for, can feel like, well, wait a minute, you're on everybody else's side but me. Like, I just need you to be here with me right now. So that's another mode. There's the validator. So I think of the validator as like your biggest cheerleader, the person who is always on your side. And some of us play this role more often than not in conversation, where we hear, okay, you're going through this issue. It's not your fault. Like, and then we'll maybe even systematically look for, like, well, whose fault is it? Like, let's figure that out. But it's definitely not your fault. Can be wonderful. It can be a pep talk, can boost you up, can be a nice reminder that, like, it's really not you. Also might not totally be true, might lack perspective. Maybe you even know this. And so that can feel disingenuous. And then the last one that I will mention is the identifier. So the identifier tends to hear things and find ways to relate to you or to the situation. And so in this case, they might be searching for, like, oh man, that sounds so hard. It sounds like when I dealt with XYZ, like insert personal story. And identifying is done with the intent to connect, but it can really cause distance if that's not what the other person is looking for, because it can sound like, okay, now you're making this all about you. Like, I haven't even finished telling my story, and now we're already on to your experience. So with all of these modes, they sort of have this, it's two sides of the same coin. One side really generous, connecting, helpful, and then the other side just not what the person is looking for, which is why it's so important to think about, what is this person actually asking me for in this conversation? I know what I want to do. I know what I want to say intuitively, but is that what's needed for?
Got it. And so when we do, if we are lucky enough to figure out what's needed, or skilled enough to figure out what's needed in conversation, do you have any advice for getting better at listening modes that we're not used to using?
Yeah, I guess I'll just address the first part, because I think you can figure out what is needed sometimes just by, context clues about the situation, sometimes what you know about that person, what you've learned about them over time. Like, okay, this is a person who generally, wants to unload but doesn't want advice, for example. And also you can ask, like, you can say, what would be most useful to you now? Or you can acknowledge, my instinct is to brainstorm some solutions. Is that what you're looking for here? And give them a chance to say yes or say no. So just to, demystify the sort of, like, it's not like a mind reading thing of, like, what do they need, right? We're getting some clues based on what they're saying and how they're behaving and their body language. And then also we can ask clarifying questions to get us closer to that. Your second question about, what can we do? I think the first step is just, like, figuring out, like, where do I start? And how often is that coming up? And are there situations in which I am maybe switching into a different mode? Or are there situations in which I might want to try switching into a different mode? And just trying that out. And I do think giving yourself the grace to like say or recognize, like, this is what I usually do. Like, this is what I want to do. Let me deliberately try this other way. Can be useful. Saying it out loud, if you have, the kind of relationship where there is rapport, can also be helpful. Of like, I really want to give you, my like 5-point plan for what we can do moving forward. But what if we tried something different? And then, doing that together.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a lot of places in the book where you're like, yeah, it's okay to express your intent, and kind of what you're trying, and sort of expressing that in order to gauge your partner's needs. Like, it's okay to say um what you'd like to try, or to ask. And
Totally. And like, this is a conversation, like it's a dialogue. It's not a monologue where one person has the mic, and it's not a lecture where one person is telling the other person what to do. It's a conversation. It's a collaboration. It's a dance. And so I think anything that we can do to show up more fully, is great. And so if part of that is, laying it out there and saying like, hey, I'm going to do something different today. Like, will you run with this with me? Like, can we try that? I think is great.
when we're so in part two about navigating the conversation, it talks about kind of how to clarify your role, which is sort of what we talked about a little bit, like figuring out the other person's needs, how to deepen the conversation, how to stay flexible if it goes in a way that you don't expect, how to make sure that you understand what the other person is sharing, and then it talks a little bit about guiding the conversation, which I thought was interesting, because it's sometimes something that facilitators need to do. Can you talk a little bit about that, and why and how we might do that?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the beginning of the book is really about opening up the conversation, giving it space to breathe, and seeing where it's going to go. But of course, we have goals sometimes in our conversations too, where there are things that we're trying to get to. Maybe we're trying to reach a consensus. Maybe we're trying to, come up with some next steps. Maybe we're just trying to feel more connected to this person or team. And so as facilitators, I think knowing like, what are we trying to do as a group? And then also making sure that we are kind of moving things in the right direction. You always want to give it space to go where it needs to go, but you also don't want to open it up so much that now we're just, in chaos. And so I think that that's kind of the facilitator's role, is to let things breathe, but also like keep them moving in the right direction. And so a lot of that is about making sure you're kind of striking a balance between making sure that everybody's voice is heard, and also making sure that you don't have, one person dominating, or one person's issues kind of just like taking over everybody else's. And so a lot of it is striking a balance between saying like, okay, like opening it up, to the floor, but then knowing, well, this side of the table, never really speaks up, and this side of the table is very, very vocal. So I'm going to deliberately like thank this side of the table. Thank you so much for that contribution. That was great. And also, what does this other side of the table have to say? It's sort of like you're always acknowledging and then pivoting a little bit. You're sort of dancing between the two. And I think that can be really useful, whether you need to pivot because somebody has just like opened up a whole can of worms. It's a total tangent, it's just not necessary, or it's not the right forum, or because you just have that one vocal minority, or because you really genuinely need everybody's voice in this conversation. So that kind of formula of acknowledging and pivoting, I think, can be really useful for managing those various axes that can kind of crop up in a group setting.
So talking about managing the conversation like this, all the things that we need to do in conversation. This is a lot. It's a lot of work to do in real time. And especially because one of the themes of our conference is wellness. I wanted to ask about how one takes care of oneself, about listener drain, about how to take care of yourself when you've been doing all of this hard work and might be a little wiped out.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a takeaway that I would hope folks have in reading the book is less like, these are this is like my 50-point list and these are all the things I need to do, but just a high level understanding of like the way that you show up in conversation has to do with who you are. Like what you're bringing to the table. Like, what are the ideas? What is your mode? What is your energy level? Like, what are you bringing in, and being self-aware about that? I think like that's sort of like the one thing, the number one thing. All of the other stuff will come into place if you have a sense of what you're bringing into the conversation and can keep, checking in with that. And that's fine. You're going to hone that over time. So just, I want to first remove some of the pressure of like getting it, completely right off the bat. The other thing I would say though is, especially in professions where you do a lot of listening, any kind of facilitation involves that, or if you're a journalist or a user researcher or a therapist, a lot of roles involve this kind of listening. You do get fatigued. That's definitely part of the job. And I think this is where I talk about listener's drain, where it can happen in those professions. It can also happen if you just are trying this out in your personal life, where let's say you decide to have like 3 kind of intense, like personal conversations, like spouse, like parent, best friend, all in one day. And then you finish and you're like, whoa, that was a lot. And usually that feels like, you're pretty exhausted. You might feel some initial like adrenaline from those conversations, and then kind of like a powering down, a little bit like hard to concentrate, you need a break basically. And the way that I think is most helpful to manage that, there's sort of 2 sides. One is prevention and the other is recovery. So on the prevention side, it's really about, again, getting to know yourself and figuring out things like, well, what's my personal limit for this kind of conversation? Am I someone who can do, for example, when I was running user research sessions, can I do 5-hour-long sessions in one day? Or do I need to spread those out over the course of 2 days? How do I feel afterwards, physically, emotionally, mentally, right? Like, how is that experience for me? Or if I'm, facilitating a difficult conversation, maybe my personal max is 1 a day, maybe somebody else it's 4. So it's about checking in with how you feel, and really starting to tune into some of those limits. And by the way, like some of that stuff might also depend on like, did I have a good meal that day? Like, am I caffeinated, right? Like, did I sleep well? All of these other things that don't necessarily feel connected to listening, like they're all at play. And so paying attention to, where your limits are and what might be contributing. And then the other part of that is on the recovery side. So what are some things that will fill your cup after, potentially difficult or intense or just, loving, but kind of conversations where it's a lot and you need to recover. And that's going to look different for everyone. Things like journaling can help. Things like running can help. Running a bath can help. Some people love that. Some people hate it, right? So you kind of have to find which of those things feels restorative to you. But there's something for all of us in terms of figuring out, what makes me feel a little bit better. And by the way, I think for a lot of people who do a lot of listening in their careers, like sometimes the thing that feels best is going to someone who will listen to them, because they don't feel that they've had their cup replenished in that way. Sometimes they don't want to talk to anybody, right? It's like, I've listened all day. Like, I just want to be alone. And that's fine too, but just figuring out, what lifts your spirits just a little bit there.
Cool. So I want to step back. I'm going to open it up to questions here in just a second, but I wanted to step back kind of from what's in the book to applications of the ideas there. I was curious, like, what's in your, it's been a couple years since you wrote it. You've had time to sort of probably talk to people about it and do a lot of talks. What's an application of the concepts in the book that we might not normally think of, and where should we be applying these ideas that we're not currently? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say there are certain applications that actually surprised me, where I just heard from certain communities that the ideas were resonating. And it's been like, there's been quite a variety. So everything from a sales team that is, thinking about how to bring listening into like close deals or build better relationships with clients, to people who work as pastors, who are bringing in listening to their community in a totally different way, or at least with a different intent. And so I think one of the neat things has just been seeing, how in how many areas of our lives like this comes up. And what was the second part of your question? Can you remind me?
Just where, like, I guess as a society, as a community, like, where should we be applying these ideas that we're not currently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, like, probably in the realm of politics, we could do a lot better as a society. I think also, just culturally speaking, especially in the US, there's such a heavy emphasis on learning presentation skills or persuasion or influence or negotiation. It's sort of like all like very me oriented. And I would love to see that shift to, okay, yes, all of those skills are great. And also there is this other piece of the puzzle, which is about, receiving and understanding, and making sense of and connecting in a different way. And so I think that's a part of the puzzle that just often gets overlooked, in part because we have a very me focused culture.
Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up to questions from our audience. So let me ask, you mentioned the idea of surface listening and how folks can sometimes only be partially present and attuned to the conversation as a listener. What have you seen, and how would you address surface speaking or talking, or situations where you yourself or your conversation partner are only speaking at a surface level?
Yeah, I do think those tend to go hand in hand. Or in some cases, one person is really deep and the other person is totally surface, and there can be some conflict there, because you're not on the same page. I think that pausing in conversation is something that is really underrated, and can help get us back on track. So if you realize you're in conversation, you're like, wow, this is really like, we're not going anywhere, or how did we get here, or there's some kind of disconnect, or I'm just talking and I'm not really paying attention, just giving yourself a moment to pause. And literally that can be in the conversation, like you offer a pause. And you'd be surprised at how often the conversation will open up in a different way. I think a lot of us are afraid to pause in conversation. We feel like we need to fill the air. And in fact, that can be where some of this sort of surface talking comes from. We call it an awkward pause. We really don't like silence, but there's something very powerful about silence and giving you and your conversation partner a chance to go, oh, here's a little space. Like, let me see what I want to do with that space. Maybe the silence means I actually don't have anything else to say and I'm done. Or maybe this silence is a chance for me or the other person to actually bring forward, the real issue that, maybe you've been talking around, or, people weren't ready to talk about.
Let's see. Okay. Um, here's another question. In order to better understand the needs of our conversation partner, what can we look for or observe as clues when thinking about their needs?
Yeah. A couple of things, and you're going to have some advantages if you're in person, as opposed to, your Zoom box, but there are going to be things like, are they making eye contact? Are they looking away? Which, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean they're not connecting. It might mean they're thinking, or that's their habit. If you see someone kind of like touching their collarbone, maybe they're fiddling with a necklace or a collar or something like that. This whole area is like a self-soothing area. That's like usually what we do when it's like a way for us to kind of calm down. We do it without, thinking about it. Um, if you notice that someone's feet, maybe in conversation, are not facing towards you, but are facing, let's say towards the door, that could be a sign that they're over the conversation. They're ready to move on. With all of these things, it's not a sort of dictionary definition where it's like, your feet are facing that way, like you must be done. It's more like, take this as an initial sign to get curious about. Many times it can be that, but it's not always, because people also have, their own little ticks. And then the other thing I would say is also just paying attention to tone of voice, and pacing. So are they getting really excited about something and so they start talking faster? And is that unusual for this person? Or does that tell you something about, what it is that they're saying or thinking about? So you're looking for these clues in addition to being able to, ask the question of what they're hoping to get out of the conversation.
Makes sense. So let's see. We have someone who asks, applying listening in the political spectrum and negotiation, is there a basic effective template one can engage that can bring more success?
I mean, I wish I could say that yes, because I love a good template too. I mean, I think the way that I think about the book is like, these are all tools. And then it's up to you, depending on the setting that you're in, to sort of pick and choose, try some things out and see what works. Because every individual is different, it's going to be hard to have a precise template. But generally, employing these tools, generally expressing curiosity, generally asking good questions, generally setting your opinions aside, at least for part of the conversation, those things are generally going to help. And then you'll probably find that some things, you may need to tweak. For example, maybe there's an imbalance of power in the conversation. One person has more power than the other. That's going to change the dynamic. There are cultural differences. That's going to change the dynamic. So you kind of start with what you've got and then tweak as necessary.
And are there any areas where you see people, I mean, I know like everybody's different, everybody has their own struggles, but like what are the most common ones that you see out in the wild?
Yeah, I mean, two quick ones come to mind. One is just, that habit that some people have of like reading a newspaper headline, to their spouse at breakfast, or, mentioning a thing at lunch to a coworker that just feels like a nothing. It feels like okay, random trivia, but like, why are you telling me that? It can feel like that. Um, those are all bids for connection. Like sometimes I guess my point is like sometimes a really small thing that feels like a throwaway comment is actually like the person going like, hey, I want to connect with you. And you have to do a little bit of work to go there with them. And it's very easy to dismiss these small bids as, well, they're just somebody who likes to talk aloud, that's that. And so paying attention to those. And then the other thing that I would say is like, there has been research by linguists. There's a woman, Deborah Tannen, who has done research across gender, for example, on just how we use language. And there are some interesting things, sort of like common miscommunications. For example, if one party in conversation says, men tend to, not always, but tend to hear that, interpret that as agreement. Whereas women, not always, but tend to say that as a way of acknowledging the other person and what they've said. So there's a huge difference between acknowledging what you've said and agreeing with what you've said. And so you can kind of see how that could quickly cause confusion or, make things more challenging, certainly, to be on the same page. And so there are these little things that do tend to come up quite frequently.
When we're thinking about deepening or expanding a conversation, can you talk a little bit about, we have a whole chapter on kind of confirming our understanding. Is repeating what you have heard from the person, i.e. summarizing their thoughts as you perceive them, an effective method to deepen or expand a conversation?
I would say yes, with the caveat that you want to be careful with how often you employ it in conversation, because it can start to sound a little bit robotic to the other person, or like they might start to feel a little bit like, why do you keep repeating everything? But if you use it in a subtle way, it's a great way for you to test out what you think you're hearing and get confirmation of so what I think I'm hearing is this. Does that sound right? Or it sounds like the group, wants to punt on making this decision. If anybody disagrees, without reading, let me know. So there's ways to do it naturally in a conversation. I would just caution about, summarizing every sentence. There's probably other things you could do, like ask another question, see where it goes. One thing that I like to do if I think the person might have more to say and I'm sort of waiting to see if they'll take me there, you can allow them to say what they've said and then say oh, and that's because, and then just pause. It's sort of like an ellipses right there, a dot, dot, dot. And usually the person will fill that in. So there are other ways to gather more information in addition to, summarizing what's been said. But that's a great one too.
Sort of thinking about all of these things that we can work on for a conversation. Are there any well-known people out there who model these things well? Is there anybody we should look to for good examples of this?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think if you haven't heard any of Esther Perel's podcasts, that's a great place to start. So she is a therapist and she focuses on relationships between couples and also working relationships. So, founder partners. And she has several books, but where I think she really shines, or at least where you can really hear someone who's really good at listening in action, is in her podcast, where she records these conversations. They're just like a therapy session. They basically are therapy sessions that are recorded. And you can hear her doing the work of creating space, asking a very gentle follow-up question, and sometimes a not so gentle follow-up question, like if she has earned the right to do that, but you can kind of hear the conversation progressing towards something. And the other thing that I really like is that when she makes a conversational mistake, there is usually narration voiceover where she'll say what I should have said in this moment was X instead of Y. And here's why. And I think that's just it's sort of like the cherry on top for really getting a masterclass in listening, and also shows that even when you're a good listener, you're still going to make mistakes, because that's life. And that's also again, it's what you bring in. Sometimes I think often in her case, for example, when she does make some kind of mistake or wants to do something differently, it's because she has been emotionally activated in some way. Something that the person has said has caused an emotional response. And that's usually when it's hardest for us to listen, because we're having this emotional response. So I really recommend her work.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. I also remember you mentioned, I think, Lori Gottlieb as well. And I mean, if I could train an AI on her articles and just have an AI therapist, I would probably I'd probably go for that. Um, yeah, you talked a little bit about just now about kind of emotions, um, and like emotions getting in the way, being emotionally triggered. And that reminds me of kind of the chapter on difficult conversations. I really connected with the part in there about regressive relationships.
Mm.
And can you say a little bit about that? How those things can impact our ability to listen empathetically?
Definitely. Yeah, there are conversations that will be harder than others. In some cases, that's because what you're talking about is challenging. Maybe it's taboo. People don't like to talk about money, or if they do, they like to talk about other people's money, but not their money. So it could be a topic, but it can also be a person. It can be hard to have a good, like a really connected conversation with a boss. You just have a different kind of relationship. You also have these regressive relationships, which basically emerge, particularly among family. It can also happen with a group of friends that you've known for a long time, where whatever your role was in that unit, the family unit or the friend group unit, or some other unit, you can be totally out of that and not behave that way. And there's something about coming back together. Everybody takes the same roles. And so if you grew up as, the jokester at home, or the person who always had a temper at home and have a completely different, or feel that you have evolved and have a completely different experience, as an adult, just being back in that family unit, it's like, well, there's no room for this new you. There's only room for this old you. Like, that's what we expect. And it's very easy to go back to that. You sort of have to actively work against it. And still, it's more than likely that there may be a conversation where you do go back into that. And so I think giving yourself the grace of knowing that these systems are in place and that it's very hard to break out of them, is one thing. I think also when it makes sense, doesn't always make sense to do this, but when it makes sense in a really difficult conversation where you feel that you are getting emotionally activated, if there is trust, if you can be vulnerable, um, trying out saying like, I want to have this conversation. I'm having a really strong response to what's being said, and I don't think I can fully bring what I need to bring to this conversation right now. Or just saying like, I can feel my blood boiling, like I need a minute, right? Depending on whether it's a personal relationship that you feel like can be really open, or something where you feel like you have to be a little bit more careful about. I've had people say like, oh, they could never say that kind of thing, and then I say, well, everybody uses the restroom, so you can always say like, I actually need a break. Like, I'll be back, right? So there are ways to kind of create breaks in there if you feel that you really are getting emotionally activated.
Got it. Jumping around just a little bit. When when I kind of finished the book, my thought was like, these ideas are obviously either easier to apply face to face,
Mm.
which is better than, and that's easier than phone, which is easier than messaging. Would you agree with that? And would you have any thoughts about like how we might shift our interactions from like less conducive mediums to more conducive ones?
Yeah, part of me wants to agree with that and just say like, yeah, the more you strip away or the more digital we get, like the harder it is. I think that can be true. There are obviously real advantages to being in the same room as someone. You just get so much more information, just like visual information, auditory information, by sharing the same space. And so that is going to be helpful for you to make meaning of, what they're saying, what they're looking for. Are they picking up what you're putting down? Like, are you super disconnected? You have a lot more signal. And so that can be really useful. I hesitate to say though that like that's the best option. Like that is what we should do. We should always try and do in person. I think it really depends on what kind of conversation we're trying to have. So, when the pandemic happened and everybody went to video call, that as a default, I think is also problematic, right? Where it's like, there are some conversations that are great over video and there are others that are not. So I think of it more as like, what am I trying to do here? And is this something that is best served in person? Is it best served over the phone where I like maybe, sometimes people have really tough conversations and it's better to not be sitting across from them, not feel like, oh, I'm kind of like in battle with this person across from me. It's like just having them in my ear. Some people do some of their best thinking while they're walking. So, okay, great. Take that creative brainstorming call and like do a walk and talk, whether that's over the phone or, side by side. And so I think just allowing for the possibility that like we can use these different formats. I think we just need to be a little more strategic about what we're trying to achieve and which of these formats will help us do that.
Got it. So while I'm waiting to see if we have any more questions rolling in, I want to ask, you published this book in 2021. Is there anything that you would revisit or add or remove? Yeah, how have you thought about it in the 2 years since it's come out?
Yeah, I think sort of what we were just talking about is probably the thing that I would flesh out more, because this book was published during the pandemic. And so there was a chance to address video calls or, digital connection a little bit, but not nearly as much as probably, knowing how long we were going to do video calls, I probably would have dedicated a little more time and space to it.
Got it. Okay, so I just got a question from someone in our audience. We talked about different listening modes and some of the challenges and benefits to these. For those who are problem solvers, what might you suggest for them to better connect with and support the people in their lives? Is there something they can do to help themselves be more present in ways that are supportive to others, or perhaps things they should not do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a problem solver too, so I understand the challenges that come with doing that. And it can be really great. It can be really great. Like you're the person that people probably go to, remove some hurdle that a team or a group or a person is facing, or figure out like what is the right strategy for moving forward. So I don't want anybody to feel like they have to abandon their mode. Like there's still a lot of value to be had there. I think just being aware of when that instinct comes up and trying something different. So, for example, one really small thing that you can do is when you have that instinct to offer a suggestion or a solution, try asking a question instead and just see what happens. And that can be a way to kind of disrupt that instinct of like, must solve everything. Just use it as an opportunity to get curious instead.
Yeah, that's excellent. I feel like that's excellent advice. Like that's something I find myself challenging myself to do, like not always succeeding, but like how can I, if I have a statement, how can I reframe that as a question?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we have reached the end of our time. So Ximena, I want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and experiences. I would also like to thank Phoenix Strategies and Conflict Resolution Month in Colorado for today's talk, especially Michelle Noyes and Kristen Noble. I want to thank the Estes Valley Restorative Justice Partnership, especially Denise Lord and Becky Weller for partnering with the library to bring Conflict Resolution Month to the Estes Valley community. I'd like to thank Denise for helping me consolidate questions. I want to thank our volunteer Misty for providing technical support for today's webinar. For folks who registered, I will be sending out a follow-up email with the survey about today's talk. Unfortunately, I can't hire a user researcher to tell me how to create better talk, so a survey will have to do. We'd love it if you could fill that out and let us know how we did. In that email, I'll also include any resources mentioned during the talk and information about our sponsoring partners. So again, thank you all for being here. And Ximena, thank you once again.
Thank you so
And
much for having me. This is great.
thanks. Have a great afternoon, everyone.